Hey, Refuge Church, it's wonderful to be back with you for another week working through the book of Exodus or Shemot. This week, we've got a story about a donkey. We've got stuff about genitals. We've got a little something for everybody. So let's pray and jump right in. God, I thank you for the varied content that we find in your text. We never need to be bored with the same old stories over and over because there are so many wild narratives for us to pour through. I thank you that you invite us to intellectual engagement, and I ask that you would help us today come into that space and be thoughtful, critical thinking, and also open to what it might be that you have for us to hear this week in the midst of these wild stories. I ask for your spirit to attend to us and to minister to us and to help me be clear as we go over all these different theories and thoughts and considerations. So I thank you so much again in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, so like I said, weird, wild stories today. I have never heard a sermon on these particular topics, and I'm guessing that you haven't either. So we're all in kind of new territory for ourselves here. The JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, they put out a commentary with their Tanakh, with their Bible that they publish. And over this section, it says, meaning unknown. So we're going to have a lot of fun this week, I hope, talking over the oddities and missing pieces and interesting considerations in these stories. So let's dive in without further ado. Exodus chapter 4, or Shemot chapter 4. And this week we'll be looking at verses 18 through 26. So context, God and Moshe have been having this long back and forth of Moshe having complaints about or reasons that he doesn't think that he can do this thing that God is calling him to do, and God saying, yep, you can do it, go do it. And that has finished up with God saying, fine, I'll send out Aharon, your brother, will come out to meet you, and he could be your partner in this calling. So finally, Moshe seems to have gone along with it, though he hasn't said anything in the affirmative to God yet. And so verse 18, it says, and Moshe walked, which is resonant because this whole time God has been saying, therefore walk, now walk, go walk. So finally he's walking. Whew, he was in the backside of the desert, if you remember, behind the desert, way out in the boonies. So he has to come back. So it says he walked and returned to his father-in-law, Yeter. This is the guy who's already had his name changed before. He was Elle, and then he was Yitzro. Now he's Yeter. If that's confusing, I'm on board with you. You can go back to further sermons back. We talk about potential reasons why his name changed, but his name here still means over and above or abundance, and we're about to see that again. So he said, presumably Moshe here, please, I would walk and return to my brother who is in Mitzrayim, or Egypt, and see if he still lives. So a couple of possibilities here. Some translations don't acknowledge that it's a singular brother, and they say brothers in order to make it hopefully look potentially like Moshe is not being deceitful here. So they change it to brothers from brother. However, it is singular, so there's a number of things that could be going on. One, Moshe could just be lying to his father-in-law about the reason that he's going back, which I can empathize with. If I was out in the desert doing my job and an angel who then turned into God appeared to me in a bush that was on fire, and then I needed to go back and tell my father-in-law about how this voice told me that I needed to go save an immigrant community, I might also change my paraphrase of what happened, right? And so that's a possibility. Instead of owning up to all the craziness that he just experienced, he's just saying, hey, I do need to go back to Mitzrayim, but it's to check on my brother. That's one possibility. Second possibility is he really does He's not all in on what God has asked him to do yet, right? We didn't have any verse previously in which he says, okay, God, I fully trust you and I'm here for it. Let's do this. The last thing we heard was God say, hey, I'm going to send out your brother to you to help you out. And so him saying, I'm going to see if my brother is even alive, kind of makes sense. If he's still in this place of not trusting, not being sure, and God says, fine, you can have help. Maybe he's saying, fine, I'll do this thing, but only if my brother is still around. What are the reasons that his brother might not be around? If you remember, the reason or part of the whole oppression of this immigrant community is a partial genocide. All the firstborn sons were being killed off. And so it's pretty reasonable for Moshe not to be sure if Aharon made it through that initial genocide, or if he's been killed off via the hard labor that was instilled around the time that he fled from Mitzrayim, right? So that's reasonable. So what's Yitro going to say? Oh, before that, there's also the third possibility, which is that he is really just hoping that Yitro will say no, right? Like, I'm having this conversation with God and God keeps having really good comebacks for all of my objections. So I'm going to stop talking to him about it. Instead, I'm going to poke around and who knows, maybe my boss / father-in-law will say no. Oh, I would love to, God. I would love to do what you've asked me to. But, actually I checked. And my wife's dad and the guy who employs me, he said I can't really leave. So I would really have loved to, but I guess I just can't. Oops, so sad. We love to do this too, right? Come up with all sorts of reasons why we don't need to do the right thing. We don't need to do what our conscience is telling us to do because it's not convenient, or I would have, of course, but I wasn't feeling well that day, whatever. We come up with reasons. It might be Moshe is doing the same thing too. All right, so now for Yitro's response. We've had father-in-laws in the past, think Lavan and Laban, if you are familiar with the story of Genesis, who have not been so keen on the protagonists in this story taking their wives or the daughters of the father-in-law off and departing. There is quite a back and forth, right, between Lavan and Yaakov, the grandfather of Moshe, I believe. Yeah. And so we kind of have bated breath to see what will Yitro sash yeter sash Ruel say. He could very understandably be annoyed at him taking off, potentially with some of his financial resources and with his daughter and with his grandkids. It's not really done in their culture, right? You move in to the patriarchal home and live in community with them. So what will he say? And Yitro said to him, go to peace, which is great. He doesn't say go in peace. He says go to peace. Shame on your translation if they cut that out. Okay, but that's so lovely, right? This guy who's one of the most stand-up, upright, wonderful figures in this whole narrative, he comes back later, understands what's going on with Moshe. So he has so much opportunity to quibble with, right? It's not that Moshe just said, I need to go back to Mitzrayim. And then he can just say, okay or not okay. He comes up with this reason. And as soon as you give a reason, that's something someone can argue with. So he could be like, oh, I'm sure he's fine. Or why? We're your family now. I adopted you. I gave you everything you have. I gave you my daughter. Problematic as that is. How could you possibly be still interested in this old family who you already disowned? Or that's just one thing that he could say, or it's not safe for you to go back. I don't want you to take my daughter and my grandkids with you. That's unacceptable. So he could have said all these things. However, he sees through the filter that Moshe puts up and sees that it doesn't really matter the reason. Moshe is not at peace. And so cutting right through all of the baloney to the heart of what's going on, he says, go to peace. I believe that we'd be much more effective leaders, friends, parents, kids, workers, etc., if we could also leave aside all of the details and the swirling narratives that are around us, and instead connect with the suffering or the hurt or the anchor, the dissettlement, that's not a word, that's at the heart of why people are doing things around us. So it's so easy to get caught up in whatever the discussion is, whatever the disagreement is, whether in faith or politics or just how we live our life. But seeing through, like Yitro was able to say, you know what, I might not know what's really going on here, but I do know that you are not in total wholeness. I know that you're not thriving in well-being, and I want to free you to be able to do whatever it is that you believe is important to be able to find that shalom. This is a use of shalom here, this well-being, this wholeness. And so he says, go to shalom. So hopefully we can have a worldview of abundance, like Yitro's name, like his character, and stop trying to control the people around us and let them be free to try to find peace wherever it is that they're finding, as long as it's not, hurting people, which again, Yitro could have thought about. Maybe it's going to hurt his daughter, but he didn't argue about it. It's pretty admirable. Okay, so going on. You might imagine also Moshe here saying, darn. You might have been hoping, like previously mentioned, that Yitro is going to say no, and then he'll have an excuse. But he says, go to peace, and you can kind of picture Moshe's face falling a little bit, and he might sigh. And that's backed up by the next line. It says, and God said to Moshe in Midian, and that use of that and usually denotes that some time has passed. There'll be no and, it'll be a more set little paragraph. I'll put in the translation. If it's a line break, that usually denotes time passing. So Moshe says, okay, great. And then doesn't leave, which causes God to have to show up again in Midian. The narrator puts in just so we know that he hasn't left yet. And he again says, walk, return to Mitzrayim. So come on, let's go, bed. You said that you were going to, let's go. And then he says, for dead are all of the men who sought your soul. So God, first off, has not lost patience with him, again, telling him over and over and over and over. If there's a niggling thought in your head that won't go away, that might be an indication that that's God working with you on something through your conscience or intuition, or however you want to think of that. But he sees through also all of the stuff that may or may not be baloney that Moshe puts forward. And instead of saying, I already told you Aharon is alive, you don't need to check and see if he's alive, you just need to go. He sees what the heart of Moshe's being unsure. And instead of wondering whether Aharon is still alive, he answers the unspoken question, nobody's going to try to kill you when you go, which is obviously a big deal. I would be worried about that too. I can understand Moshe's apprehension. And so God kindly doesn't wait for Moshe to say, look, I would go, but these guys, they want to kill me, and so that's not really safe. He jumps in there and answers that concern already. And so Moshe finally does not have a comeback, for it says, and Moshe took his wife and his sons. They rode upon a donkey, and they returned to Egypt. And Moshe took the branch of God in his hand. Okay, this is a big deal. This whole series of sermons, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And now he's finally going. He takes the branch of God in his hand. We already talked about how what that branch symbolized, right? How it's a symbol of authority and leadership for him, and him taking it is a symbolic, okay, I'm owning my role. And then the other thing that's put in here that I promised already is they rode upon a donkey. An odd detail to include, right? We probably wouldn't notice if this verse was gone, just thinking, oh, they walked, or oh, they found a camel somewhere. Nope, they rode upon a donkey. If you have your Jesus ears on, ding, 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 ding. Christmas wasn't that far ago. You might remember In Matthew, there's this narrative also about Jesus going to Egypt on a donkey. That's very deliberate by the author of that gospel, making these continual allusions all the way through his narrative about how Jesus or Yeshua is the culmination or greater or a type of Moshe. However, this isn't Christmas. We're not talking about Jesus at this moment. And so we'll, instead of looking to the future, we'll look to the past. Why is this donkey included? First mention of donkey, as I'm sure you already knew, just popped right to your mind, is in Genesis, as usually first mentions are. Also, if you don't remember what we mean by first mention, or you're not sure because you've joined us more recently, I think it's in like one of the first two sermons we talk about what the hermeneutical tool of first mention is, and it's just the idea that first time something pops up, that we're supposed to remember it as a quintessential archetypal image for all the other mentions through the text. And we're supposed to remember, ding, 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 oh, right. Because in the culture of the text, it's a society in which they would have really valued the text and memorizing the text. And so they knew all these first mentions really, really, or at least somebody in their community did who could tell them. All right, so donkey, where does it first show up? It first shows up in Genesis 16, I believe. There is either an exploitative scene or a Bonnie and Clyde scene. I prefer the Bonnie and Clyde because I like to imagine the women in these stories as being empowered and fully agents of their own destiny. And maybe Sarah wasn't in this scenario. However, Abraham and Sarai go down to Mitzrayim to escape a drought, and Avram passes off his wife as his sister and allows her to be taken into Pharaoh's harem. Super problematic. Oh boy, right? So either that's super horrible, or Sarah was in on it and was like, oh yeah, I'd love to be part of the harem for a week vacation, man. Sounds great. And then there is a series of events that, again, this isn't a sermon on that passage, so go study it if you want to get into all the crazy details. But they end up leaving with everybody mad, but Pharaoh gives them a lot of wealth, and wealth in that era looked like livestock. And so they leave, first mention of donkeys, they leave with donkeys. Throughout the text, donkeys, whom I love, by the way, favorite animal. So it's a little bit too bad they're getting bad cast here. But donkeys continue to show up in these other sketchy passages. Eliezer, when he's trying to find a wife for his employer's son, says, we're super rich, we have donkeys. Later, Levi and Shimon will murder a whole village and take their donkeys. Super upsetting passage, but again, it's I don't have enough, and so I'm going to plunder. And what's that plunder but donkeys? And then lastly, in another sketchy kind of a con, Levi and Shimon's thing is definitely a con. They lie and then murder everyone. But with the story of Yosef, there's this whole thing where he holds his baby brother Benjamin, he's not really a baby, he's just the youngest one, hostage and kind of kidnaps him. And there's this whole thing in that story with the donkey as well. So if you think about it with an eye to those stories, it's kind of profound that here, maybe it's included for this reason. Moshe is bringing the donkey back to Egypt. So first, Abraham, his great-great-great-grandfather, probably right number of greats, steals basically financial wealth, and now he's bringing that back after all these negative stories, one of which I skipped that we'll get back to. And he's returning it. And when they leave Mitzrayim again, they will have a lot of financial wealth. But as we already prophesied from God talking about it, they will have received that wealth through much more honest means of just women asking women for it. And that'll be handed over. And so that's kind of a cool echo. And we're about to have another, if you're more of a fan of the Jesus stuff, another Jesus analogy we'll see in a moment. And so going on. And God said to Moshe, in your walking to return to Egypt, see all of the beautiful things I have placed in your hand and do them in the presence of Pharaoh. And I will strengthen his heart, and he will not send the people. Say to Pharaoh, the Lord says it like this, Yisrael is my firstborn son. I say to you, send my son that he may serve me. If you refuse to send him, look, I will kill your firstborn son. And so there's a lot of language in there that we're going to have to get back to later. There's these themes, strengthening his heart, doing these wonders in his presence. Beautiful things is the kind of the root of that. But the part that I want to focus on right now is the part about the firstborn son, because God is framing it in this paradigm of firstborn sons. And it's partially put here because the next story is about a firstborn son as well. However, so that's the frame. So the next story is about firstborn sons. The first story in Shemot is about the murder of the firstborn sons. And so God is very clearly saying, look, you've done this to the firstborns. I don't even have to allude back to that because you already know all the sons were thrown in the river and were killed. And now I'm claiming Yisrael as my firstborn. And he is letting him know from the outset that if Pharaoh does not comply, does not come along with what God is asking of him, to be like his daughter, if you remember that imagery from a couple of sermons ago, then he's going to lose his firstborn son. And that kind of frames the plagues for us maybe a little bit differently than we were taught them, about how I tend to think of the plagues as they unfolded and they escalate and they escalate and they escalate and they get crazier. And then finally it all culminates in the death of all of these kids, which is super horrifying. And I don't want to diminish that in any way. However, this might be framing it a little bit differently with God saying at the outset, if you don't do this, I'm going to enact a retributive justice. You took these sons, I'll take your sons. And he tells them that from the outset. And all of the other plagues then can be seen as delaying mechanisms of like, you know what I told you. Remember, are you going to believe me over and over? I don't want to kill your sons, so I'll fill the river with blood instead. Do you remember what I said? I don't want to kill your sons, so I'm going to send a bunch of locusts. This is the locust motion, apparently. I don't want to kill your sons, so that might help you in the future. Okay, but back to the story. And on the path at the inn, so ding, 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 Jesus thing again. There's a word specifically for lodging at a place different than your own house that you sleep for the night. And that's the word lalun, which is lovely. And so it could be an inn, which I left in that translation because it reminds us of Jesus, but it also could just be a campsite where travelers stayed. We're not sure. Okay, but it says God visited him, and then we get crazy. And he sought his death. Now, we have no idea who these pronouns are. It could be God sought Moses' death. It could be God sought his firstborn son's death, because that's about to come up. It could be, there's 3 different male characters here. And so if you interchange all of them, there's 9 possibilities of who's trying to kill who, which is super confusing. And we'll look at it in a second. And Tzipporah, who's Moshe's wife, if you don't remember, took a flint, and cut the foreskin of her son, and she touched it to his leg, still don't know who the his is there, and said, you are a groom of blood to me. And then it repeats itself, saying, that she said that because of circumcision. And so this is super bizarre, right? This is the story that the JPS says, we don't know what this means. There's a whole Wikipedia article just about this story because it is so odd. However, let's go through the different theories of what is going on here. So the first question, who's trying to kill who? Midrash explains this whole story. The main surface level point of this Midrash is that it's kind of reminding the reader circumcision is really important and it has to happen on the eighth day. So that's the motive. They don't want to make Moshe look bad. And so they say Moshe was planning on circumcising his son this day, but instead he was getting them set up at the campground. You know, he was like putting the tent together, and that's why he hadn't done the circumcision yet. And God was annoyed, and that's why he was going to kill him. And so therefore, people, remember, circumcise your son should be your first priority. That makes sense if you're trying to convince a society of people to do a extremely invasive, painful procedure. I get that, why that might be, that would be put in there. But even more fascinating than seeing the story as that kind of mechanism, rather than having God want to kill Moshe, which also makes us a little bit uncomfortable, right? Why would he have this huge calling on his life and say, you're so important and it has to be you? And then a couple of verses later, once he said yes, immediately went to murder him. That's weird. So they have it be instead that these two giant snakes came and they were different angels or spirits. A really big thing in Jewish interpretation, especially a little bit later. And one of these giant snakes bit Moshe all the way up one leg, and then the other one all the way up the other leg. So he looks kind of like the Starbucks mermaid. And so Tzipporah, his wife, sees this happen, and she sees, if you use your imagination a little bit, what is not being bitten off by these snakes. And that reminds her of circumcision, and she thinks, oh, this is because of circumcision, goes and circumcises her son. That is pretty wild. If I saw two snakes, giant snakes who were demonic eating my husband's legs, I would not immediately think, oh, we must have skipped a sacred ritual over our son. I would think, holy crap, those are some giant snakes. I don't know what to do, probably. But that's the story that solves the problem of it being God wanting to kill Moshe, which doesn't make sense. I agree with the Midrashist that does not make sense. But I'm going to have a little bit of a different approach. One other approach that I think is fascinating is there's a Samaritan interpretation. The Samaritans, along with the Karaites, if you've ever heard of them, along with everything that you've ever heard from the story of the Good Samaritan, what's fascinating about them is they were a group who thrust aside all of the rabbinic interpretation and laws that had been put in place by the religious leaders in Jesus's historical day, which is weird because we in the Christian community think of them as being bad because the narrators kind of do, but we miss, we're kind of Team Samaritan if you don't particularly love the Talmud. I think the Talmud's great. But anyway, so they have a very different interpretation of the text than the traditional Jewish one. And they translate, instead of her son, which would be Bina, they think of it as Bina, which is spelled the same way, which is the word for understanding, which is sometimes used for heart. And so there's all this talk in Jesus's time and following among the followers of Jesus about circumcision of the heart. And the idea is that perhaps Tzipporah is the first one to talk about circumcising her heart to be part of the family of God. Bum, bum, bum. That would be super fascinating, and at least is probably an interpretation that they were aware of because it comes up later. But I don't think that makes a lot of sense contextually, because I don't know how you would circumcise your heart and then throw a foreskin at somebody. But that's okay. It's still nice. So what do I think is going on in this text? To talk about that, I've got to talk about circumcision. There's two big images happening in circumcision, which you probably also haven't listened to that many sermons on, so it makes sense if you're totally confused about why doing surgery specifically on boys' genitals makes you part of the family of God. That is weird. I get it, and I agree, and it's not inclusive, just putting that out there, but you can go back and look at the story of Genesis to try to a little bit get a hold on what's happening there. But one thing is happening, and we'll look at the biblical angle, and then we'll look at the cultural, historical angle. So the biblical angle, you don't make a covenant, you don't write a covenant, you cut a covenant. And so in Abraham's story, first, he cuts all these animals in half, and it's a blood path covenant. You could search the word on Google, blood path covenant, and you'll come up with stuff about it. And so circumcision, instead of cutting an animal in half, you're cutting yourself, if you're a man, as a symbol of the covenant, right? So that's the main biblical image. But why didn't he say, what the heck, what is this? Why do you want me to do this, right? Abraham, we kind of take it as for granted that, oh, of course, then he did it. Instead of saying, that's wild. It wasn't wild to Abraham because it was a tradition in the culture around him historically. And it came from Egypt, and it did spread up northward to the area that Abraham was originally from. But it started in Egypt, in Mitzrayim. And what was it about? Why did they do it? Very different than circumcision in American culture now. Has a lot to do with the 1950s and purity and diminishing sexual desire, along with graham crackers, cornflakes, and the Boy Scouts were all invented to try to diminish masturbation, specifically in boys. And so that's kind of the reason that we have it today, according to a lot of scholars and thinkers. However, not the case in ancient Egypt. They were a pretty pro sex positive society. And it was a part of the elite. It's part of the priestly order in the very fascinating society of Egypt. Circumcision, once you went through it, gave you access to the divine mysteries, to the practices of the religion, to the rituals and incantations, etc. So you couldn't learn these things of the divine and these secret mythologies and all the stories about all the gods if you circumcision, which is a very handy way to get women out. But so it has this cultural resonance. So along with the cutting of the covenant thing that's happening between Abraham and God, it's also a thing of God saying, you get to know the mysteries of me. You get to know who I am. You are on the inner circle of knowing this mystery. And so we've learned in this passage that Moshe has not circumcised his son, potentially because he's worried about his son being killed off. He's worried about when he goes back to Mitzrayim, which I think potentially Tzipporah is referencing when she says, you're a groom of blood to me, because God's just showed up and said, hey, there's this whole thing about the death of the firstborns, and super dramatic. That might be where Tzipporah is coming from there. But Moshe has looked at his son and said, you're not part of this. I don't want you to be part of this. You're not part of this crazy lineage. You're your own person. And I'm not looping you in. If you recall, he didn't give his son a very positive name. It has to do with being an outsider, right? And so he said, nope, all this insanity, you're not in on it. And so Tzipporah, somebody's not pleased about that, which might be God. It also could be that it was Moshe who wanted to put his son to death because he didn't want the Egyptians to do it, because he wasn't really trusting what would happen there. I'm going to take us all the way back to Abraham again with the donkey. One other story, looping it all together here, makes sense in just a second. Abraham takes his donkey, ding, 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 and loads it up with branches and his son and 2 servants. And he sets off on a donkey to go to the mountain to kill his son. I believe in that story, God tells him specifically, take your son and go to sacrifice on the mountain. It does not say go sacrifice your son. And so I think that was a misunderstanding, and Abraham, maybe as part of a test, thought that God was like the pagan gods of the area, and a fertility god who says you have to sacrifice your son and trust me that I'll give you another one. And so it could be, again, that the author intentionally put this donkey story in here, not just because it's a donkey returning to Egypt, but we have the same number of people that we had with Abraham, and now a son is going to die if something isn't done. But instead of a ram and an angel saving the day, Zipporah is the one who saves the day. And she says, she's talking about Moshe's failure in some way here, even if we can't exactly understand why she says bridegroom of bloods specifically. Bloods comes back to the Cain and Abel story about murder. And so again, it could be that she's saying you are betraying your own kin, like Cain killed Havel. You're trying to kill my son. I don't think so. I circumcise him. He is part of this story. He gets to be in on the divine mysteries too. You're not going to cut him out. He's also part of the family of God. How dare you? I think that's what's going on. You might not. If so, please come to discussion. We can have it out in the first section of our discussion that we have on Zoom every week. You're welcome to come and ask questions if it's all very confusing, which I would understand. However, again, we have these themes over and over in this first part of the story of Shemot, that people, especially the protagonist, try to cut people out and try to say, you're not part of this story. And sometimes we do that to ourselves and say, I'm not part of this big story. And sometimes we do it to others and say, yeah, I get to do this calling, but not you. You're not on this team. And we can also, of course, be thankful that God is not a punitive God who demands that we kill our firstborn. It's always nice. But so we can go forward remembering that God includes whoever God wants to include, and that we don't get to draw those lines, right? We talked a lot about that last week. We don't get to draw those lines in the sand. God knows what we're wrestling with, and he hopefully will put yeters and yitros around us and help us to be yitros to the people around us, and have that same worldview of abundance to let people go and do whatever it is that they need to do to find their peace. And so really complex, dense material. Hopefully those takeaways are still helpful for you. And if not, hopefully it was a good exercise in wrestling and trying to understand this pretty bizarre story in the text. Crazy sermon, right? We got a little bit of Jesus. We got a little bit of wrestling with these biblical images, and hopefully we can come out remembering that we are still included. We get to know the mystery. Some of us can say, I'm just here to do the thing. I'm not here to understand any of it. And circumcision of the heart, right, that we're still included in as Gentiles, right, in the story in Paul's epistles. And the new covenant, as put down in the major prophets, tells us that in our heart, we also have access to understanding these great mysteries of God. And so we are invited to do that. And sometimes we can get a little bit lazy and say, I don't know, I'm just here to, try to be a good person. It's great to try to be a good person, and it's great not to be holding on super hard to saying, I need to figure this out, and feel totally paralyzed until we can figure it out. But let's still be pursuing those mysteries as circumcised people in our hearts. Let's try to be understanding these stories and count ourselves in on that story as being people who have access to the mysteries of God. How cool is that? So I'll pray and hope to talk to you guys about all of this wildness on Sunday night at 7:30 on Zoom. Link in the description if you'd like to join us. God, I thank you that you invite us to seek out your mystery, that we are included in that story, that you don't just want us to keep our head down and do what we're told. You want us to seek out truth, to seek out understanding, and how exciting and precious an invitation that is. Please help us not to take it lightly, but to really honor that and take the time to try to figure out why it is that we believe what we believe, or challenge what it is we believe, or look at weird things like circumcision and try to grapple with them. I thank you that we're invited to do that, not just to be a zombie army going around doing whatever it is somebody else has told us that we're supposed to be doing. And I ask that we would know Yitros, who encourage us to go to peace, and that we might be Yitros to the people around us. I ask that we would have a worldview of abundance, that we would have the eyes of compassion to be able to do that. And that we'd spend less time arguing with people around us and more time trying to understand where they're coming from and what they're motivated by, and empathizing with it. I thank you that you empathize with us and you know us in all of our crazy ways, really honestly. And I thank you for all these things and ask that you would do them in us. In your name, Jesus, amen. All right. I already talked about joining us Sunday at 7:30. If you feel so compelled, if you feel blessed by this space and this community, please join us in giving or tithing. You can find the link on our website. There's a floating bubble in the bottom corner of our website, or just click the link and I'll take you straight there to Rebel Give, where there's a setup that can help you. And then, as always, there's a link in the description to the PDF that is the translation and discussion questions, and you can look at those discussion questions even if you're not coming to discussion, and just use them for contemplation with yourself. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week. Bye.